KOWS 107.3 FM, Occidental, California. On the telephone, we have Ms. Margaret Swedish. Good afternoon.
Hello, Ken. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you here. Where are you? In Ohio, Wisconsin?
In Wisconsin. I'm in Milwaukee.
In the home of your birth.
That's right.
Yeah, Ms. Swedish is one of seven from a staunchly Republican household, so it doesn't get much better than that.
Well, I can't say that about us anymore, but those are my roots.
Well, you know, the Republican Party, for the most part of American history, has been a fairly reputable and even honorable political institution.
Oh, absolutely. And, of course, you know, they were born here in Ripon. It's one of their acclaimed home bases. But once upon it was started out as an anti-slavery party, so it has an interesting background.
How far we've fallen.
Yes.
Well, Margaret Swedish has a background worthy of enumerating. I want to go start with this important book of hers first, and then we can fill in details of your career. The book is called "Living Beyond the quote End of the World," unquote, or perhaps better said, "Living Beyond the End of the World: A Spirituality of Hope," and it is described as, at least by the publisher, as a chilling forecast of ecological catastrophe, an outline of the moral and spiritual resources we will need to survive. And what strikes me, one of the things that strikes me right away, is that the book is now a good 4 or 5 long years old.
Yes, I actually wrote most of it in 2006 and 7.
So you were pretty much ahead of the curve.
Well, it's one of those times where I have to say, you know, there's not a lot of satisfaction in sort of reading the signs of the times and seeing what was about to come, and then all these things actually are occurring. There were some pretty scary indicators, and they are definitely playing themselves out right now.
Mm-hmm. Margaret Swedish spent 20 years leading the Religious Task Force on Central America and Mexico, and was the editor of Central America/Mexico Report. She was involved with the Spirituality of Solidarity program and authored a book called Like Grains of Wheat, A Spirituality of Solidarity, or co-authored with Marie Dennis. What else should we know about you before we begin to talk about the world we're living in?
Well, I think some of it is just, the Religious Task Force was what I did for 24 years, so that really embodies a good chunk of my adult life and was my great teacher in many ways about what's really going on in the bigger world. My roots here in Wisconsin, to which I've returned after being away for a long time, this has been a very interesting journey for me because I really am a Midwesterner through and through. I really, these are definitely my roots, my geography. My family was deeply embedded here, and I've spent a lot of time sort of reopening that whole history, which is part of what I'm trying to write about now. And that has kind of reintroduced me, I think, to the real world in a whole different way than being in Washington, D.C., doing that sort of foreign policy work for so many years.
Mm-hmm. The book has been described as a lamentation. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, I think there's certainly lamentation in it. I always, sometimes when people ask me about it, I warn them and say it's certainly not an easy read. I really felt it was important to put a lot of these very scary indicators about our future together into one book, and so it makes for some pretty hard reading. And I put my heart into it. There's some very heartfelt things in there because the losses are mounting, and there's a lot of reason to lament a world that we are losing, that I feel in my own lifetime. So much of what I loved about the planet has already changed permanently. And so there is lamentation in it. There's also hope in it if you go all the way through to the end. I always tell people, be sure you go all the way through to the end to get to the hope part.
Right. It's there.
It's there.
And it seems to be increasing by the day.
Definitely. People are really waking up to what's happening.
Yeah. May I call you Margaret?
Yes, please.
Would you tell us about the image on the cover of the book? It's quite striking.
Yes, and that was actually chosen by the editor, but I thought it was striking as well because it's one of those images that I think just that sort of communicates the sense of ecological wasteland, environmental wasteland that could be our future if we continue the way we're going. And so I think that's what they were trying to communicate with that cover. I find it very stark myself.
Yeah. It's a photograph of maybe 6 or 8 trees that have been guillotined.
Yep. That's dead trees and what really looks like what was once a vibrant forest that's now just dead.
Yeah. What's meant by the word liberation?
Oh, that's an very interesting question. I mean, liberation for me, that word, of course, I came out of that work, the Solidarity work, which was very much rooted in that whole liberation theology movement in Latin America. And what that movement did, which I think is very applicable right now, is really look at what are the various forces of oppression that often control our lives and make decisions for us. And that liberation is when we come to some real understanding of the forces at work in the world and free up our own capacity to really address them and change them and feel some freedom of choice in making the world that we really want instead of the one that's given to us.
Mm-hmm. Are you encouraged by how we're doing?
Well, I think there's good news and bad news in it because in terms of the overarching framework of like the global economy and the way it's moving right now, I think the signs are that the institutions right now are not willing to change in the fundamental ways that the times require. I mean, everybody today is marking this arrival at a population of 7 billion. The United Nations wants to throw parties, but mostly I think what's being communicated is that this world is getting increasingly stressed, and we're not seeing the kinds of responses yet, the political, economic, cultural kinds of responses that I think we need to have if we're going to keep ourselves from having this very difficult future. I mean, so in the large scale, I think the signs have been rather discouraging. On the other hand, sort of at the grassroots level, and the Occupy movement being one of them, there are these expressions all over the planet of people who are beginning to create the new way of life, right in the midst of this other very oppressive framework that's trying to force this global economy in a certain direction. And more people are beginning to say, wait a minute, I don't really want that world. I want something else. I want to return to roots. I want to help the earth heal. I want to recreate the human community. And, as I say, that kind of thing's happening everywhere. There's almost nowhere you can go in the world where you don't see some expression of that energy, that desire to create something new.
Do you think there's a sufficient understanding yet that the world that we've grown up in is, whether we like it or not, is over?
Well, and again, I think a lot depends on the vantage point. I run into more and more people who know that. I think that as a culture, we are not yet able to recite that narrative for ourselves, to really create that narrative, to tell our own story. All stories come to an end at some point. Mm-hmm. And this society was built on that great industrial dream that started back in the mid-1800s with the steam engines and the railroads and all of that, and we just kept going and then after World War II, of course, is the huge industrial boom that fed this myth of the great American dream, this myth of affluence for everyone, this high standard of living for everyone, even though it never quite lived up to those expectations. So to come to this point where we can say to ourselves, I guess that story's over. It needs to be over. It's starting to bring the earth to a point of severe crisis all over the place. To come to that point is a very hard thing to do, and culturally we're certainly not ready to do it. Mm-hmm. What I am finding is that there are more and more individuals and small communities that are able to say that.
Yeah. In the preface to the book, when you're setting the table for us, you say that the question has changed from how to prevent a terribly destructive, turbulent, and perhaps disastrous time in human history to how we're going to live through it. So this strikes me as a fundamental change in our orientation that the culture as a whole is, I guess, approaching.
Yes, I think it's very hard for us to admit that we don't have solutions to our problems. We still have that American can-do kind of spirit. There's no problem that can't be resolved with a certain amount of ingenuity and innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. What's happening is the drivers that are at work now that are changing the world because of how much we have weakened the Earth's ecosystems, is that those drivers now are in place. And the question really is how bad things are going to get. Because already we're beginning to see, again, all kinds of manifestations, not just in terms of climate change, where we can look at what's going on in Texas, for example, this year, or what's going on in Bangkok right now, or this unbelievable storm that just happened on the East Coast. There's never been anything like that on the East Coast, the month of October, ever in human memory. So, is all that related to climate change? I think some of us know that it is. And so we're already seeing that there are beginning to be disasters piling on disasters. But we also, I think, economically, there's this realization that something about the global economy obviously isn't working anymore. There's no quick fix to that. So we see all of these different drivers at work that keep leading us deeper and deeper into crisis. The growing gap between rich and poor, the concentration of wealth. These are overwhelming problems, and it would be hard enough to deal with them one at a time, but we have them all happening at the same time. So there begins, for me at least, this challenge, I guess. I come from a social activist background. A lot of that work on Central America was all about how we could make the world a better place. Well, now, how do you live at a time where the world actually really is headed into more and more stages of crisis? And what do we do when we face that? Because part of it, like I said, one of the questions is, how bad are we going to let it get before we're willing to shift the paradigms? But also, since things already are getting pretty bad in a lot of places, how do we live in that now? What kind of values are going to hold us together? What kind of resilient communities can we create in the midst of the breakdown?
Right. What's going on in Bangkok right now?
Well, they've just had these massive floods. They had these torrential downpours a couple of weeks ago. And all of this water started heading right towards Bangkok. And it was there was a combination of these record floods that then combined with a lot of the damming and leveeing that, same kind of situation we have along the Mississippi, where sometimes these torrential downpours meet all that human engineering, and Bangkok's underwater. They're just facing unbelievable flooding situation. I think it peaked over this last weekend. And, as a city of 9 million people, was ordered to evacuate. So that's pretty, these are stories all over the place. We keep hearing about record floods and record drought and long dry spells and Arctic Ocean melt. One at a time, those may all seem like just interesting, alarming, unique events, but when you start putting that whole picture together, you begin to get a sense of a planet that's got a lot of stresses that it's responding to right now. And then we have this huge population, so that flooding in Bangkok would have meant one thing 100 years ago, but now with 9 million people, it's also a huge human disaster.
Right. I want to quote another line from the preface, and I'm leading up to what I think is the crux of the book, which is your work in with dealing with our moral and ethical obligations and failures, and our spiritual response to the reality that is upon us now. But I want to read this first. You write, we seem ill-prepared for the times that are coming, and we will have difficulty rising to the challenge, in part because we have benefited so lavishly from the present construct of our world. We have developed a deeply entrenched national religiosity that protects us from seeing the truth about ourselves and the situation we have created with our extravagant lifestyles. Will you speak about that, please?
Yes, I think depending on one's vantage point, where you are sort of geographically and politically facing the crisis that's coming, makes a lot of difference in how you approach it or what you think about it. And I think for us here in the United States, what makes it all the more challenging is this feeling of, I call it a national religiosity. It's deeply rooted in some of our especially our Puritan background that still is with us. We're the city on the hill. We're the beacon of hope for the world. We are the righteous. I mean, that's all very much part of our language, and we hear politicians, again, using that language a lot as we approach next year's election. When you believe that about yourself, I think it's very hard to take that turn where you realize there was a dark side to that. And that dark side is beginning to really play itself out right now in the way that we're wrecking our own part of the planet, in the way economically things have turned out to be not sustainable, like we're not actually able to carry an affluent middle class forever. That turned out to be part of the myth. But when you believe so much in your own moral superiority, and I mean, I do think it's a moral superiority that we believe about ourselves, beyond the political and the military and all of that. It's very hard, I think, to come to terms with the fact that maybe there are some moral underpinnings here that have never been really healthy, that have actually been undermining that picture for a long time. It's like going back to those statements that were being made after 9/11, that we were being attacked because we are good. John McCain said that famously. Why did they attack? Why do they hate us? They hate us because we are good. If you really believe that about yourself, it's hard then to make that leap and say, well, maybe they hate us for other reasons. Maybe there's an experience on the other side of our actions in the world in which people see us in a different way. And I think that's what we're facing right now, is that we have come to the limits of where that American dream could take us, how much that mythology could inform who we are. It's all being shaken right now. The can-do spirit's not going to resolve the crisis for us. We have a politics of meanness that has really settled in. We're finding we're politically paralyzed right now. We're not able to take any kind of fundamental action about any one of our problems because we have such polarization now built into the political culture. So to come to arrive at this moment where we say, whoa, maybe there's something wrong with that picture of ourselves. Maybe when we look in the mirror, there's another reflection we should be seeing. I think that's a very difficult leap for us to make.
Can we make it? Will we make it?
Well, many people are, and I think I wrote this also in the beginning of the book, that for me, part of the experience of my Central America work that I take with me is the fact that, I mean, myself included, so many people, North Americans, did have their lives turned upside down by Central America. And the reason was because they went down to see the reality. And I think what we're finding also in our ecological crisis, as well as now this growing gap between rich and poor, I give the Occupy movement a lot of credit for changing the national discourse on these economic issues. I mean, they've changed the way the news is reported. Now everybody's talking about the concentration of wealth. That the more we begin to see, really experience what's going on, the more we can allow ourselves to step into that reality, I think the more we see a willingness to change. So where is the change happening? It's happening in people who have come up against the real limits. It's coming to the places where people have seen their old geographies altered, where the water is poisoned, where, it's like in Kentucky with the mountaintop removal coal mining. The Kentucky communities there have been mobilized by this great tragedy that's happening in those areas. So it's the people who are really feeling the reality, seeing it, and are immersed in it, and who invite us to come see it in the same way the Central Americans invited us to come and see. That's where I think the change comes, and there is a lot of change coming from that experience.
I heard this great thing about the Occupy movement. We had a guest last week, Michelle Bowens, and he called it the first native movement of the digital generation.
Oh, that's a very interesting way to describe it, yes. I mean, I think, in the recent years when I've been talking about sort of the ecological reality with audiences, some of my favorite groups are young people, because they get it. They get it in a way that I think my generation still struggles with, because we grew up in a world that was so full of promise and upwardly mobile and all of those guarantees that life would always get better, one generation to the next. And now here's the generation that knows that's not true. So they're looking at reality, again, from a very different vantage point, and I often find that I can actually assume a lot of knowledge and experience when I talk to younger audiences.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it was always an empty promise, or or do you think we were honestly, with great integrity, just mistaken or deluded? Can we forgive ourselves our trespasses?
I hope we can. I mean, when I think about how serious the situation is becoming, when you think about, for example, like here in Wisconsin, where we've got a lot of issues of contamination in water, of forests being lost, of farmland being ruined, and all of those sorts of things, I always say to people, it's not like we intended this. We didn't set out to destroy the planet. We didn't set out to make a wreckage of our beautiful home habitats. It happened so fast because of the dynamics of the capitalist economy, the economies of growth, and that the way that we created work for a whole generation before us with the factories and manufacturing, again, here in the upper Midwest, that's so much our history after World War II, is that the soldiers came home, the factories were churning out the goods, there were appliances that were changing the lives of women who, instead of having to wring out the clothes by their hands, could stick them in the dryer. I mean, we had all of these changes that went on, and that it's not like that generation intended this result. I'm sure there were some people, like when I think about the tobacco companies, who knew that cigarettes caused cancer for a long time before that information got out. There are many corporations that I think know the damage that they were doing before we all got a handle on it. And now we're learning from that experience that we better be careful about what we say yes to. People are becoming more careful about what they buy. More questions are being asked about the sources of our products and those sorts of things. So I think, yes, we need to forgive our trespasses because we didn't intend this. The question then becomes, once we know, then what do we do? Because we're very addicted to this lifestyle now.
What are the Just Faith Ministries?
Just Faith Ministry is a group that started, it's quite a number of years ago now, but this is a group that was very much impacted by Catholic social teaching following the Second Vatican Council, and with a certain frustration that the institutional leaders of the Church weren't always the best articulators and leaders of that, what is actually a very progressive social teaching, kind of took matters in hand and created this wonderful project that's basically a 14-week course that you can take in parishes. Small groups get together and they study Catholic social teaching over these 14 weeks, I think is the full program. And it's been a great animator. It's one of those things that really got a lot of people excited about getting involved in all sorts of justice ministries. And then they followed up that initial program. They had about 14,000 people in the first few years that went through this process. And then the Just Faith Ministry folks said, okay, we've got these 14,000 people, now what comes next? And what they came up with as the next project is what they call Just Matters, where people have created these modules, and they asked me to create one based on the book, modules of 6 to 8 weeks studying specific justice issues with the intent that in the end people will find ways to take action. So it's been a lovely model, actually.
Yeah. And you've chosen as a title for your website, Spirituality and Ecological Hope.
Yes, because I think that the reason why I wanted to get at spirituality is because I still believe that most of us are motivated by our values, by the principles by which we live, by the frameworks of meaning out of which we operate. And so ultimately, if we're going to look at how we live in the world, we have to get back to those basic frameworks of meaning and see which ones work and which ones don't. And that, especially when we're talking about living through hard times, we have to have that sort of spiritual resilience that gets us through those hard times. So for me, ecological hope and spirituality are deeply related. If we only look at this in terms of political activism or trying to make policy changes, it can be a very long, hard slog. But if in the midst of that, and again, we really found this in the solidarity work, that where community was built and where people were really sharing something in common together, a common cause with a set of principles that animated all of us, cultural expressions that emerged from that, ritual, the kinds of things that we shared together all through those years. It made it not only an easier slog, easier to get through dealing with some very hard things that we were dealing with in Central America with the human rights violations and the civil wars and the poverty, but there was something really beautiful that was created in the context of these communities and these groups of people working together. And for me, that was sort of the spiritual expression of it that made the work not only hard, but also beautiful and sometimes full of joy. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to really develop and grow into as we head into these more difficult times.
Mm-hmm. You write that the longing for meaning seems a stronger motivation than selfish fear. And you also say that you've watched people throw all of that away, I guess meaning the selfish fear, when they discovered a reason to be alive and a purpose and meaning to the human journey and their own lives. I guess I'm getting my syntax a little screwy. And their own lives that made doing so far easier than one might think. So here you're touching on the moment of even a very subtle moment of transformation when we understand that facing all this squarely really empowers us and sets us in a very enlivening and encouraging direction.
Yes, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are very freeing for people. One is that if you understand what's going on, sort of why the world is the way it is, I actually think that's comforting. It's harder to have life changing all around you and not know why. That's very fearful. That's very scary. And I think, in terms of my book, I have to say, in terms of the positive things people have said about it, the ones that mean the most to me are when people tell me, now that I've read the book, I get it. Now I read the newspaper and I understand the context, and I think that already is very freeing, because once you kind of know the reality and are familiar in it, not only is it less frightening, but then you can say, okay, how do you address that reality? Mm-hmm. What I saw with many North Americans going down to Central America, I mean, talk about terrifying. There were people who went to war zones who had never left the United States before. Mm-hmm. And they did it because something compelled them to go. Mm-hmm. And when they were able to do that, to enter into those very scary experiences and find themselves coming home not only intact, but really changed, finding a new rootedness and a sense of values and the importance of their own lives and what they have to contribute, that was really a very moving thing to watch. And I have found similar things happening around some of the crises we're facing right here in neighborhoods in Milwaukee, where people look around and say, hey, I don't really want to live like this anymore, and neighborhoods get organized sometimes block by block, and you see an urban garden go up, or a community come together to get the drug dealers out of the neighborhood, or these kinds of things that are very, very empowering and form community. And then you wake up in the morning not with a sense of, oh, I've got to go to work today, but wow, I've got something really important to do with my life today.
Right. I think it's a very special and critical distinction you make between changing and being changed. You say, I believe human beings can deal with harsh realities and be changed. I think there's something important there.
Yes, I think we have tended in this society that's very focused on individualism and the gated communities becoming probably, one of the best metaphors for our problem, is that we've built walls of protection around ourselves. I mean, I grew up, my little suburb was sort of the outlying suburb when I was a kid. Now it's just part of the big sprawl. But I can remember how protective my nuclear family was, and others in that neighborhood, protective of our own family space. The fear of the stranger, if somebody was walking down the street we didn't know, and if it was a African-American walking down the block, wow, that was really scary, and everybody was watching and wondering what was going on. So we're sort of oriented towards that kind of self-protection. It's very hard to be changed by anything if you don't let the change come in. And when the walls start to come down, as we saw with Central America and as we see in some of the other ways in which people are engaged here, when the walls start to come down, then these other influences come in. I mean, we're all actually porous if we acknowledge what we really are. You can build just so many walls around yourself. Life still gets in. And if we can welcome it and let ourselves be impacted by it, again, it just all becomes less scary. And we sometimes find some wonderful things going on when we open ourselves to the change rather than try to hold it at bay.
You quote Thomas Homer Dixon as referring to a moral failure of almost incomprehensible magnitude. Does this suggest to you some sort of possibly fatal flaw in our makeup or in our human identity? Or how do we account for this degree of failure?
Well, and that to me is one of the more intriguing points of this whole reflection is that, is there something in us that makes it so hard for us to adapt? Sometimes I think that the changes come so fast, and of course Homer Dixon wrote about this in The Ingenuity Gap, that our industrial and technological changes happen so rapidly. I mean, really, when I was born in 1949, right? So just when I think about what's happened in the 62 years I've been on this planet, right? It's so fast. We're reeling. We're bombarded with change all the time. Chellis Glendinning says we're all walking around with post-traumatic stress syndrome because none of us was really made for the world that we've created. But nor have we had time to stop and say, is this what we wanted? Did we want to go in a different direction? Would we have wanted to create a different kind of world? Now, is that a moral failure? Is it a biological failure? I mean, I think, part of what the technology and industrial change has done is it's cut us so off from our own biology that we don't have what other species have, which is a sense of the danger we're in, the danger because our habitat is unraveling around us. We've been able to numb ourselves from that experience because of, especially now with all the technology that surrounds us. So it's a great moral failure in the sense that we are allowing unbelievable suffering to unfold because we're wedded to the very economic model and the philosophical model that's bringing about the suffering. And we don't know how to stop ourselves as a species. Many people do know, but as a species, we don't seem to be able to stop ourselves. And yet, all these other expressions of change that are going on tells me, well, yes, but on the other hand, there are some people within this human species that do understand the danger we're in. Some people are beginning to get it. And the question, the question is, how bad is it going to get before we get to that point where we say, wow, we can't go on like this any longer? Sometimes these shifts happen very quickly. In the same way climate can change abruptly, maybe civilization can change abruptly.
We really are suggesting a genuine conversion experience.
Oh, absolutely. Again, especially in the Western industrially developed world. We are talking about the need to change our whole way of relating to one another and to our environment. It's just that profound.
And you suggest that what we may very well be called to is a bottomless well of compassion from deep within not only ourselves but our entire culture.
Yes, because of the fact that we're on this crowded planet now, and because we have this awareness of what's going on all around the globe, we will be dealing with shock after shock. And some of those shocks really do come from the fact that we are just simply more aware. I can turn on the news and I can see the flooding in Bangkok, and I can see the suffering in Afghanistan after that suicide bomb yesterday. And so we have these shocks coming at us all the time. We're a crowded planet. If there's an earthquake, again, 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, an earthquake might not have impacted human beings so much. Now they can wipe out thousands of people in a matter of minutes. So that question at the end of my book about what kind of human beings are we going to be as we go through this, I think that question's raised day after day as we kind of see our world. Can we begin to have a spirituality that's large enough that we can continue to embrace this world without shutting down when we see this amount of suffering. Mm-hmm. Because in many ways, this is our bond with other people. We're all going through great stresses right now. Mm-hmm. So instead of these things dividing us or making us want to put these pictures out of sight, out of mind, they could also become a very strong spiritual bond for the global community.
Yeah. You take particular interest in issues of migration and immigration, and you see them as ecological issues. Would you talk to us about that?
Yes, and of course for me, after doing the Central America work for so many years and dealing with a lot of the refugee issues, this is something that's close to my heart. And one of the things that we've seen, that we saw after the wars, where we were mostly dealing with political refugees and then a lot of economic refugees because these countries had been ruined economically by the wars, we started seeing this other change happening because of the amount of ecological ruin that had happened in countries like El Salvador, areas of northern Mexico, where we've seen that a lot of people are being uprooted by what's changing ecologically, locally or regionally. So, for example, El Salvador is a country that has been environmentally ruined. You know, it's been almost entirely deforested. Most of its water sources contaminated. It's densely populated. And so there was no way that El Salvador could even support its population, which is why almost half of it has left since the Civil War, since it ended in the 90s. And in northern Mexico, Texas, Arizona, all that area, that's one geographical area that's going through a process of aridification, not just drought, but what more and more scientists think is permanent drying of that whole region. And so people are uprooted. They can't sustain their farms. Water sources are drying up, and so people are on the move. And now we have the United Nations basically saying that the vast majority of refugees in coming decades will be environmental refugees. And we have to look at what that's going to mean for us. The bottomless well of compassion is now being played out right now, for example, in the state of Alabama, where they're trying to disappear all these undocumented people.
Right. Not to belabor this forever, but one more whack at it. You say that it's good for us that the American dream is over. This suggests to me that you're pointing toward a sort of evolutionary step forward, or a sort of responsible maturity that calls us. This sort of thing, that the end of the American dream is, in a sense, maybe the end of our adolescence.
Well, yes, I believe the thing about the American dream is that it turned out not to be sustainable. It was never completely just, but it certainly has turned out not to be sustainable. And so if the American dream has been based on creating a certain standard of living where we're consuming things that give us greater and greater comfort and convenience, that's had a huge cost in terms of the planet. And it's also had a cost in terms of human communities. There's been a breakdown not only of ecological communities, but of the human community itself. The values, the things that separate us out from one another. So in some ways, it's been a very costly dream, and it's a good thing to bring it down. I think it would be good if we could do that intentionally, with intention, even with a certain amount of grief and mourning. It would be a really good thing, as any other reality, as it dies, as it fades out, to honor it, but to realize that it's over. The narrative we bring to the end of the American dream, though, is going to make all the difference, because we're already seeing competing narratives trying to describe this time that we're living in. And some of them are coming out of a sense of still wanting to hang on to a certain economic superiority, a racial superiority. Some of it is still based on trying to uphold that way of life. I remember, George Bush Sr. saying one time, the American way of life is not negotiable, saying this in the context of a world grappling with climate change and population issues. And now we know it must be negotiable, and that the thing of gently bringing down the American dream is that we also try to articulate a new one based on a different set of values, a different framework of meaning than the one that has been so costly to the human and to the ecological communities.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that way of life made us all very happy anyway. I mean, we have found a lot of people living the economic life who tore up roots to follow the dream, moving all over the place, and finding now, I mean, I'm finding this certainly in my generation, that a lot of people who chase the dream are realizing they're far away from family and roots as they're getting older, and are wondering if this was a very good idea. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are simplifying their lives because they realize all that stuff has gotten in the way of really meaningful time. Time taking walks, time with the grandkids, time just being, time reading a good book. That this way of life has overstressed us and really ripped away at some of the things that used to most give us joy and pleasure in life.
Mm-hmm. Through your eyes, what's the proper role of religion now going forward?
Well, I think that most of the religious traditions, for me, one of the most important things that they could do is to dig deep to the places in those traditions that help provide the narrative for the times in which we live, and to be unafraid to articulate those elements of their old narratives that don't work anymore. Again, it's a very, this is not a fundamentalist position, and I know that that's challenging for some people who hold to that. But religion, because so many people in the society are still so deeply religious, there is a narrative that comes out of almost every one of the religious traditions that could help steer people towards this new way of life. I mean, the golden rule, don't do unto others what you don't want done to yourself. The notion of sharing, which is all through the prophets of the Old Testament. The beautiful Isaiah 65, the description of the new creation. There's so much that's there, and that those prophets, they inform many of our major religious expressions in the West, for sure. Mm-hmm. And then in a country that calls itself, you've got so many people saying that this is a Christian nation. I have a real problem with that, as you can imagine, since I think of us as a secular nation that's diverse in its religious and spiritual expressions, including people who have no religion at all. But in any case, since that is such a predominant narrative right now, I sometimes wish the people who are using that narrative would perhaps read Matthew 25 or Luke's Gospel and the story of the rich young man and the loaves and fishes, or read Acts where the apostles are laying all their possessions at the feet of the disciples so that everything can be distributed equally. Mm-hmm. There are some beautiful narratives in those traditions that I think could help us right now as we move towards this new way of life.
Yeah. Tell us about the loaves and fishes.
Well, for me, narrative, I love to write stories and I love to read stories, and so the narrative matters. It's a beautiful story, and the way it unfolds is that here's this crowd of people, and they're hungry, thousands of people, and it's the end of the day, and the disciples say to Jesus, what are we going to do to feed all of these people? And he says, well, what food do you have? And there's these loaves of bread and a few fish. So how in the world are we going to feed all of these people? And the way the narrative goes is that first Jesus blesses the food, then it's broken up into smaller pieces, and then it's distributed so that everybody has enough and abundance is left over. And that, for me, can become a beautiful metaphor for what we need to do right now as we face this crowded planet that's running out of food and water in many places, where the resources are being stretched and stressed, to say, how now do we bless this beautiful earth and begin to take only what we need and share, take only what we need. And if we really did share in that kind of spirit, we would find that not only can we survive, but there would be abundance left over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's true, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we can't do it this way. We can't do it with, billionaires and millionaires taking so much from the planet while so many are without. I mean, there are people who have studied this, who have said we can do this. It's going to be hard until we get the population growth rate down and all of these other things, but it's possible to do this, but not the way we're living now.
Mm-hmm. Hard is actually good. It's good to be challenged, and it brings forth the best in us, or it calls the best in us. And if if we can rise to the occasion, most likely we can be happier and healthier and stronger than we've ever imagined.
I believe that, and I mean, one of the things that I also try, when I speak to groups, and sometimes I get these rousing receptions when I say this, but it's true. The challenge we're facing is calling the best out of us right now. And I think most of us really want that. I think we've been so dumbed down by the consumer society, we've become so passive, that a lot of the depression people feel is that their lives don't have much value anymore. Now you look at the challenge that we're facing right now, where we really do, as Thomas Berry said, we need to reinvent the human presence on the planet. Wow, that sounds like a pretty incredible cause, to which everyone has something to offer, some gift that we have to offer to that project. What could possibly give us more meaning in our lives? What is important is that we begin to create the spaces and the community where people can start to find their gifts and have places to offer them.
It's been an absolute pleasure to have you talk to us today. The book is wonderful, and I'd like to invite you, if you have any last thoughts or feelings that you'd like to share with us. We have a good 3 or 4 minutes.
Well, I would say, for me, right now, I think the reason why I feel more hope than I did even when I was writing that book is that there really is a response that's beginning to take hold in a very deep way. There are communities all over, in places in Wisconsin where I never would have imagined, where I've been asked to come and do presentations, small communities where people are really wrestling with these things. And sometimes it's coming out of their own economic suffering right now, some of the losses they're feeling, but a lot of people are turning towards that inner sense of meaning. What will give meaning to my life now? And seeing the loss of resilience in their own ecological communities are beginning to turn to that kind of healing, not only to repair, let's say, the natural world, but the human within the natural world, and healing among themselves. Even families where there's been brokenness within families are finding that this can be a healing thing for them to get involved in the healing of the planet. So there's even a language that's shifted. We've shifted from a language in environmentalism where we're trying to fix the environment to realizing that we're embedded in relationships, ecological relationships, human relationships, and we need to take care of those relationships. I'm hearing that more and more. So it seems to me that there's a real deepening going on as people are getting more involved in this work and opening their eyes and rediscovering what it means to be neighbors, not only with one another, but with the trees and the fox in my neighborhood and the coyotes coming up the lakeshore and all the rest of that, and what it means to really be in deep relationship with these beings. The fact that we're recovering that, because it's something we lost with industrial society, is one of the most hopeful signs I see right now. And that's why I believe that the spirituality emerging from this movement, or I should say spiritualities, because there's a multiple expression of that, is again one of the most hopeful signs emerging right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ken. It was great to be with you.
Good. Excellent. Take good care.
You too.
From Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Margaret, Swedish. The book is called Living Beyond the End of the World. The end of the world in quotes. I meant to ask her about that. It's great to use that phrase, the end of the world, because of its resonance with religious prophecy in some traditions, and how it's a subtle, it's a different perception now that we're faced with the real end of the world, or the end of the world that we've known, or the end of the world as we've known it. Very interesting. I'm really glad to see those words in this book. Living Beyond the End of the World, A Spirituality of Hope